First ever gas execution in America. What really happened? Tonight, dear friends, we take you inside one of the most controversial moments in American prison history. For the first time ever, the state of Alabama carried out an execution using pure nitrogen gas. The man strapped to the chair was Kenneth Eugene Smith, a name tied to a chilling murder for hire plot from 1988. But what happened inside that chamber on January 25, 2024, shocked even seasoned witnesses. Smith convulsed, his body shook, and the so-called painless method looked anything but humane. To understand how a small-town preacher's desperate plan ended with the United States testing a brand new method of death, we must revisit every step from Smith's troubled past to the failed 2022 execution to his haunting final words. Stay with me, because this story will leave you questioning everything. The year was 1988 in Sheffield, Alabama, a quiet southern town where life revolved around church, family, and trust. But behind the pulpit, Reverend Charles Sennett was hiding a storm. His marriage was failing, his finances collapsing, and an affair threatened to expose him. He was drowning, and instead of confessing or seeking help, he chose betrayal. Sennett arranged to have his wife, Elizabeth, killed. Elizabeth was a kind, trusting woman, a 45-year-old mother who believed in her husband's word without question. She didn't know he'd promised her life away for insurance money. To carry out the plan, the preacher recruited Billy Gray Williams, who in turn brought in two young men, John Parker and Kenneth Eugene Smith. Each would be paid $1,000 to take Elizabeth's life. On March 18, 1988, Elizabeth welcomed Parker and Smith into her home, believing they were there to look at property for hunting. What followed was chaos. High on drugs and without a firearm, the men turned to household objects and a knife. Elizabeth fought back fiercely, but the assault was brutal and unrelenting. When police arrived, they found a staged robbery scene. Elizabeth clung to life briefly in the hospital before passing away. Days later, suspicion turned to Charles Sennett. When confronted, the preacher confessed everything: his debt, the affair, the murder plot. Then, before he could face justice, he drove to his church and took his own life. Elizabeth's sons lost both parents in 1 week. Smith was arrested quickly. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a willing participant in a vicious crime. The jury convicted him of capital murder, and in 1989, a judge sentenced him to death. But this was just the beginning. In 1992, his conviction was overturned on appeal. By 1996, Smith was retried. This time, the jury recommended life without parole by an overwhelming 11-1 vote. They saw him as guilty, but not beyond redemption. Yet Alabama law then allowed a judge to override jury recommendations. The judge did just that, sentencing Smith to death. That law, judicial override, was later banned in Alabama, but not in time for Kenneth Smith. He would remain on death row for nearly 3 decades, carrying the weight of a sentence that most jurors never wanted him to face. Fast forward to November 17, 2022. After decades of appeals and delays, Smith's execution date was set. The method: lethal injection. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Smith was strapped to the gurney inside Holman Correctional Facility. Witnesses filed into the chamber. But what was supposed to be a straightforward procedure turned into a 4-hour nightmare. Executioners tried repeatedly to find a vein, first in his arms, then his neck, then his feet. They poked and prodded as blood ran down his body. Smith vomited, trembled, and waited in silence. Time kept ticking. By midnight, Alabama's death warrant expired. The team gave up. Kenneth Smith was unstrapped and returned to his cell alive. That night exposed the cracks in Alabama's execution system. Critics called it torture, cruel and unusual punishment. For Smith, it was both a reprieve and a curse. He survived, but he knew the state would come back. And come back they did, but this time with something new. Alabama had recently approved nitrogen hypoxia, a method never before used on a human being. The concept was simple: replace breathable air with pure nitrogen, suffocating the inmate without the sensation of drowning or pain. Officials claimed it was humane, quick, and scientific. But doctors and human rights experts disagreed. They warned it was untested, unpredictable, and potentially torturous. Smith's lawyers filed appeals, arguing he was being made into a test subject. International groups begged Alabama to stop, but the state pressed forward, determined to finish what it had started. The date was set: January 25th, 2024. That morning, Smith woke inside Holman Prison knowing this would be his last sunrise. He had been on death row for 35 years, longer than many of the guards had been alive. His request for clemency had been denied. The appeals had run out. For his final meal, Smith chose a southern breakfast steak, hash browns, eggs, and a dinner roll. He ate slowly, in silence, knowing the food meant more than just nourishment. It was a ritual, a farewell. Outside, protesters gathered. Some held signs reading, "Justice, not experiments." Others prayed, sang, or simply stood in silence. International media lined the fences. The world was watching. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Smith was led into the chamber. This time, there was no gurney, no IV bags. Instead, a steel chair sat in the center of the room. A bulky industrial mask with thick hoses was strapped tightly over his face, sealing off any oxygen. When asked for final words, Smith's voice was calm. "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." The valve turned. Pure nitrogen began to flow. At first, it seemed quiet, but within seconds, Smith's body began to twitch. His feet kicked against the floor. His hands curled into fists. His chest heaved. Witness described violent convulsion, like a man drowning in air. This was supposed to be painless. It didn't look that way. For 4 minutes, his body fought against the invisible suffocation. Then he went still. But the gas kept flowing. The process dragged on for 22 minutes, making it the longest execution in Alabama history. Witnesses left the chamber shaken. Some described it as haunting. Others called it torture. When it was over, Alabama officials declared the execution a success. But outside the prison walls, outrage erupted. Human rights groups condemned it as barbaric. Even United Nations officials issued statements comparing it to torture. The irony was unavoidable. If Smith's case had been tried today, he would not have been executed at all. His jury had recommended life, and judicial override is now illegal. But history did not give him that chance. Smith's death became more than a punishment. It became a test case, a symbol of how far a system will go to claim justice. And at the center of it all is a haunting truth. The real victim, Elizabeth Sennett, a trusting wife and mother who never deserved the fate her husband chose for her. Her story, too, must never be forgotten. The story of Kenneth Eugene Smith forces us to confront two painful truths. The first is that a man became the subject of history's first nitrogen hypoxia execution, an experiment carried out in the name of justice, but one that left witnesses questioning the very definition of humanity. The second is that the true victim, Elizabeth Sennett, was betrayed by the person she trusted most, her own husband. She deserved protection and love, not a place in a murder-for-hire scheme. Smith's death may close a chapter in Alabama's legal system, but it opens larger questions. How far should we go in the pursuit of punishment? And what happens when the law changes too late to save a life? Dear friends, thank you for joining me on this journey. If stories like these move you, please like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for more prison documentary stories that reveal the deepest truths behind the walls.